Day 42. Truro to Digby. I woke up in the morning quite early and gathered everything in place to start my new adventure in Nova Scotia. I had a goal that every day in my home province was going to be a great day, and today was the start. After beginning with my daily ritual of cleansing myself and so on, I stopped by a local Tim Hortons to load up on caffeine. Then I hit the road. Heading counterclockwise and hugging the northern coastline of Nova Scotia by the Bay of Fundy, I drove through areas that reminded me of my childhood. I was greeted by the familiar, reddish-brown mudflats that I was so used to seeing. Driving along for a while, I came across the Fundy Trail Interpretive Centre. I was quite surprised to see that it was open. I met a lady there who reminded me that I was in Nova Scotia. While living on the west coast of Canada, I was so used to the rat race and everything being go, go, go. But here in Atlantic Canada, life goes on at a much more relaxed pace. The lady and I spoke for easily 20 to 30 minutes before I continued exploring the small museum. The Fundy Trail Interpretive Centre was actually housed in a small house, with numerous displays showing the forces of nature that create the world's highest tides. There was also a locomotive on display, showing how the region had a significant rail system many years ago. I did enter the locomotive and looked around, and at this time it felt a little odd as I was the only visitor to the Fundy Trail Interpretive Centre. But then again, this was the first thing on a Monday morning, so in a way I wasn't quite surprised. Continuing onwards, I walked the dirt path leading to a viewing platform from the old bridge crossing the Shubenacadie River. Only the concrete pillars remained, and the new bridge replaced the old one a long time ago. It was still cool to see, and the lady I spoke to earlier mentioned that, were it not for COVID, I would see river rafting and mudsliding at this very point. That gave me another adventure to put on my bucket list. I could see the rushing water of the Shubenacadie River flow by me. The river had such a strong force of nature and held tremendous power. After enjoying this view, I walked back to the Fundy Trail Interpretive Centre, bid the friendly lady farewell, and continued onward. I started driving on the famous Glooscap Trail, a road that follows the shoreline of Nova Scotia for over 300 kilometers. I stopped briefly at a general store called the Freize and Roy, as the lady from the Fundy Trail Interpretive Centre mentioned when I spoke to her. The Frieze and Roy was Canada's oldest general store, established in 1839, long before Canada was even a country. While I didn't stop inside, I knew that I would return for their highly rated dinner sometime during my next trip out this way. Not far from the Frieze and Roy was a lookout where I stopped to take some more photos. There was a plaque that described the history of Maitland and the surrounding area. Much to my surprise, the history of this area was something I knew almost nothing of. I also took some time to take more photos of the iconic mudflats that this part of Nova Scotia is known for. It was low tide, so I could have easily walked in the mudflats, but naturally it would not have been safe to do so. Not here. So I headed further down the road to Burntcoat Head Park, where it would have been safe to walk the ocean floor. Like many areas of Canada that see a lot of visitors, there were numerous plaques in both English and French describing the surrounding area. As with most of this region, many of the sites were established long before Canada was even a country. There was a small lighthouse turned museum located just above the mudflats. I decided to pay a quick visit, where I walked up a steep set of stairs leading to an observation point. The lighthouse itself was a replica and non-functional, but it was cool to see the surrounding area. The weather was not improving, so after a few photos, I decided to head down and walk the ocean floor. Heading down a muddy path led me to a wash station and down some steep steps to the bottom. Here would be the ocean floor at low tide. It was raining, but I decided to head out anyways. Turning on my GoPro, I filmed my adventure, walking around for a while until I decided to return to my beast. My next stop was another lighthouse, the Walton Harbour Lighthouse just outside of Walton Village. The lighthouse, like most others I have visited, was perched atop a steep cliff with a fence preventing fools from falling to a muddy demise. Looking north as far as I could see in this rainy weather was the Bay of Fundy, a place that held so many memories for me as a child. This land, this water, the air around me was so much a part of my life. Since it was low tide, I looked at how far I could venture out if I wanted to, despite visiting Burntcoat Head Park just earlier. It seemed to be as far as a kilometer, maybe even more. I decided to visit the lighthouse, still the original, as stated by the plaque just outside the entry door. Inside it was quite cramped. As I was inside, two women with Ontario plates came onto the property and started exploring as well. It was great to see people from other provinces visiting Atlantic Canada. I made my way to the top of the lighthouse, looking at the historic pictures that lined the walls inside. From the top, I was able to get even better views than standing by the cliffside fence. After spending some time peering into the distance, I headed back to my beast. On the way there, I happened to notice a rock with a face painted on it by the parking lot. Who put this here and why? Perhaps people needed a little humor during this time. I hopped back into my beast and continued heading west. Heading down the Glooscap Trail, I reached a small community of Bramber, where I happened to see a memorial plaque by the side of the highway. I wasn't quite sure what it was for, so I decided to pull over and take a look. It was a memorial plaque for those who had fallen during the horrific world wars. With the visit to the Canadian War Museum still relatively fresh on my mind, I had to take a picture to show my respect. I briefly checked out my Google Maps to see if there was anything cool in this area, and I came across the camera obscura. Not knowing too much of what it was, I decided to pay a visit. It was just a few minutes from where I was, so I just checked it out. Thankfully, it had a washroom on site, but unfortunately, I was stung by a wasp while I was using the facility. In a way, it was good that I was stung after I took a piss, and not during, otherwise it would have been messy. So the camera obscura was some sort of man-made structure that allowed one to see images through a small hole. I walked into the structure, looked around inside, and I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to see. Still hurting from the sting, I decided to head back to my beast. Regardless, it was a cool structure to see. My next stop was easily one of the most historic and tragic places in the history of Nova Scotia. I visited the Grand Pré historic site. Since visiting the province of Quebec, I was exposed to the numerous historic battles between the French and English. But here was a tragic history in Atlantic Canada, known as Acadia at the time, where the Acadians were expelled from their homes by the British. Like many tragic events throughout the history of Canada, the resilience of the people overcame the hardships that they endured. I walked into the main visitor center of the Grand Pré National Historic Site and was greeted by a young woman who was fluently bilingual. I tried to speak to her in my poor French that I would like to view the rest of the site. After paying my entry fees, I was free to explore Grand Pré in all of its history. The visitor center had numerous First Nations carvings that were created by hands that held great talent. Thankfully, the artists that created these masterpieces were celebrated with their own plaques as well. What was shown was how different cultures combined together to build incredible art forms for the people to enjoy. British, Acadian, and First Nations all came together in peace to build artwork that shows the unity of the people in Atlantic Canada. The wood carvings were a story to tell the world about the history of this people in the region. The history of the deportation of the Acadians was a brutally difficult history to view. While I was happy to be back in my home province of Nova Scotia and was familiar with the history of the Acadians, it was still heart-wrenching to see this. The Grand Pré National Historic Site was so perfectly designed that it seemed like something I would find in Ottawa. There were a number of displays that not only reminded me of the history, but taught me a whole lot more than I ever knew or even remembered. Showing how the division between the Acadians, First Nations, and British during this time made me come to appreciate and feel gratitude for how peaceful we are in modern times with multiculturalism. While proxy wars were being fought around the world for many millennia, it seemed like the British and French used Canada as another battleground, with the civilians being the ones who lost the most. Naturally, plundering and rampaging of villages came as a result of this proxy war. People who came to this new land to start a new life would fall victim to the decisions of others as far as an ocean away. Grand Pré's numerous historical displays were created in such a manner that respect was paid to the Acadian victims in this dark chapter of Atlantic Canada. The Acadians had their own flag, which was still flown to this day, as well as their own cross, as they are Catholic-based. The creation of the Grand Pré National Historic Site was credited to the tireless efforts of those who wanted to preserve this area to remind everyone of the tragedy that befell upon the Acadian people. There were a number of famous creations that brought the story of the Acadian deportation to the world. Novels and statues were some of the ways that the world recognized the history of the Acadian deportation. As I left the visitor center to see the rest of the site beyond, I was greeted by a group of statues that depicted a last-minute goodbye where a family was broken up. These lifelike statues were created by artists who wanted to show the world how the Acadians were exiled from the settlements they lived in. It was a rather sad setting as these lifelike creations stirred up emotions. As I continued past the statues, a famous statue, likely the most famous in all of the Grand Pré National Historic Site, was coming up in the distance. This was the statue of Evangeline from the novel Evangeline, A Tale of Acadie. The statue of Evangeline depicts a young woman named Evangeline who suffered from the deportation of Acadians. Coincidentally, the day was overcast, which added emotions to this tale of sadness. Just past the statue of Evangeline was a church which housed a museum. Given that this was a National Historic Site, the grounds and everything on it was in immaculate condition. During my travels, I've seen historic buildings that were in disrepair, but the Grand Pré National Historic Site was incredibly well preserved. Numerous paintings, statues, and plaques decorated this small church-turned-museum. Everything indicated how traumatic this tragedy was for civilians to be expelled from their communities. The stories of the Acadian people and the injustice displayed how lives were broken, families were broken. But the love and faith of the Acadian people was never broken. The resilience of the Acadians stood like stone in the face of the storm that was unleashed upon them. This church turned museum served as a storybook to tell the real tales of the Acadian people. Just outside was a famous area called the Well in the Willows. This well had a long history, and despite originally being used to feed livestock in this farming community, it had been designated as Evangeline's Well, in homage of the main character of the novel, Evangeline, A Tale of Acadie. Beautiful willow trees surrounded this area of the Grand Pré National Historic Site. Despite its beauty, there was a tremendous sense of sadness with the history of the Acadian deportation. Again, the overcast sky gave the environment a solemn feeling. Despite the sadness I felt, learning a much deeper history of the Acadian deportation that I've ever known, it was still great to be back home in Nova Scotia. I was loving every minute of being back in Atlantic Canada, back on the soil of my childhood, and being back by the Atlantic Ocean. After spending some time wandering the Well in the Willows, I left the Grand Pré National Historic Site with a much deeper respect for the Acadian people than before. The stories of their suffering as well as their resilience struck deep into my heart. Not a far drive away, I ventured onto Evangeline Beach. The weather was starting to mist a little bit as the temperature dropped slightly, so I didn't stay here long. Again, I had to remind myself that it was COVID and I should just enjoy the solitude, as under normal circumstances, this area would have been packed with people. The rocky beach was on the south shore of the Minas Basin, and it was difficult to see anything with the thick fog in the distance. Nevertheless, it felt great to be back home in Nova Scotia. Heading back to my beast, I located a cool, scenic area called the Blomidon Lookoff. I drove over and again was greeted by fog. Eventually, the fog lifted, just for a few moments, but I was able to take a few photos. It was beautiful to see the valley surrounding the north shore of Nova Scotia in the distance. The Blomidon Lookoff also had signs of people's love for each other, and no doubt there would be padlocks placed here if it were possible. Heading back to my beast, I followed the northern shore of Nova Scotia towards Digby, where I decided to stay the night. Along the way, I passed by a small fishing village called Harbourville. I would have loved to stop and have fresh clams and chips, but unfortunately, everything was closed due to COVID. I continued heading west, passing by another small village of Morden, where I came across the French Cross. This was a memorial for the Acadians who sought aid and refuge across the Bay of Fundy, who ultimately paid the price with their lives. There were a set of stairs leading down to the rocky beach, the same beach that the Acadians used to flee for their lives. It was eerily tranquil, but given the history, I had to have some appreciation that we no longer live in a world such as that. At least, if you don't factor the current pandemic. I headed back to my beast, fired her up, and drove off to Digby, where I would stay the night. I arrived at Walmart, confident that car camping here would be fine for one evening. Today had been such a wonderful day, filled with emotions and memories. Tomorrow would be another adventure. Thank you for sharing in my experience. If you enjoyed my video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would truly appreciate you sharing my video on your social network, as it helps my channel grow. Be sure to check my playlist to see different categories on my exciting adventures I'm sharing with the world. Life is an adventure. Let's share this experience together.